have you all got very clearly in your mind this recognition of the way in which these muscles interdigitate, interplay, interbalance, not merely the pubococcygeus, but the pubococcygeus with relation to its next door neighbors? Way out here is the gluteus maximus. And then you get the next layer in. What is the next layer in? Don't tell me. But at any rate, you've got an iliococcygeus outside of the pubia, immediately adjacent to the pubococcygeus. And then you've got a gluteus maximus lying on top of that. And all of these forces must balance. In order to balance the pubococcygeus, in order to balance the center of the body. And now, if you think in terms of this, you begin to get more reality on the thumb screw that we were talking about yesterday. Now, in this book somewhere, it speaks of the percentage of people, the percentage of women who are, quote, cured through this exercise of the pubococcygeus. And it's not that big in terms of the percentage of what you might call cures, only don't let me hear you saying that word outside this room. I will most certainly get very strong soap, Felsnapper, and wash out your mouth if I hear that dirty word cure. But in here, they talk about, I think it's 70%. It might be even lower. I was just looking for it and couldn't find it. A response that they get. Now, what happens to the rest? What? The structural integration class doesn't know what happens to the rest?
They get processed.
That's the trouble, they don't.
They can't move the muscle. It's tied
The
down.
muscle is unbalanced. It's unbalanced. Now give consideration to what unbalances it. And the answer is everything that attaches to the pubes, to the pubic ramus, to the coccyx, to the whole area that runs around and defines the edge of the ileum. And now you begin to see that what you were doing yesterday is being done in a different sense. And you're now no longer just trying to get a cosmetic effect on the inside of the legs. And you had an absolutely magnificent demonstration of this here yesterday. I've never seen a better one. Of the way in which this whole mass of stuff on one side suddenly let go, and the mass was still on the other side. And where you get these masses, I need hardly tell you, you are not going to have any balance within the mass. Most of you have had your hands into this kind of stuff often enough that you know that there is no balance within that mass. It's an amorphous blob. Only blob sounds more willing to be moved than most of those masses are. And this is where you are going and where you are working and what you are doing in the fourth hour. Now, Mac and I have just been having a very interesting private conversation as to how both of us believe that the state of the pubococcygeus muscle in any given human, male as well as female, I mean he didn't add that, I'm adding it, is really a very large, well, maybe it isn't a determinant. It may be an index of the personality. But at any rate, if you can evaluate the personality, you can get an awfully good first approximation of what the guy's pubococcygeus is doing. And you get these people who are unable to project themselves. Sharon is a very good example, and I don't like to talk about her when she isn't here, and I hope someone will tell her when she comes back exactly what I've said. Sharon seems to be quite unable. I have a great deal of trouble hearing her because my hearing isn't as acute as it might be, but she can't project her voice from her to me. Do you remember Sharon's lumbar section? And if you remember Sharon's lumbar section, do you visualize what the positioning of her sacrum was, of her coccyx necessarily, and it may be worse, it may have been worse than was apparent from the sacrum. You see, here's this whole picture of a failure of support from below. Now, when that gal really gets fixed up, she's going to be quite a gal, because she's got all the makings, but it just wasn't where it was available to her. And this is a very interesting consideration. You might substitute it for some of your other meditations. This evaluation of personalities in these terms. But at any rate, this doesn't show us. You don't see the answer until you are able to use it. It's like an algebraic equation. When you solve for one of the unknowns and then you put it into the equation, then you can begin to get the other unknown. And if it works out, it's got to work out so that they're both working at the same time. You don't have the answer. And this same sort of thing goes on in this complex of personality and physical beingness. Okay.
You know, the thing you just said about the anal levitory and projection of voice, this was one of Reich's big points, that the throat and the anus were very closely linked.
You can look at it in terms of Reich, that the throat and the anus are linked, or you can look at it in terms of ordinary physiology, that the cervicals and the lumbars are necessarily linked.
No, I was just mentioning
Yeah, well,
just another
thank
direction.
you. I'm not arguing. I'm glad not to look at something else. But what I'm saying to you is that then you can take Mr. Reich in his psychological connotation,
Right.
you go back
Put it
right back
into
to
the
your
body.
physiology.
Same thing
And
anyway.
by and by you get where all good Rolfers are, that there ain't no psychology, there's only physiology. Now that's Rolf's heaven. Any of you that are going to come to heaven with me have to subscribe to this.
When you're interviewed by Psychology Today, that would be a good opening paragraph.
Well, I've been interviewed and it's over now. I'll have to get them all steamed up to give me another interview.
Just send them that in a telegram. They'll be done.
The whole story.
Just that one sentence, you know.
Well,
Western
why don't some of you people report that to them and tell them they better look into this? No use having spies around the country if they don't report back to the major headquarters.
The first time I meet Sam Keen, I'm going to say, gee whiz, Sam, do you know you guys are studying something that doesn't exist?
Well, I hate to tell you, but Sam is a convert.
Sam knows. Yeah.
Sam's a convert, only at this point he doesn't dare to flaunt it too widely. In fact, you know what I was trying to persuade Sam to do the other day? I was telling Sam about a scheme we've had with Dick Price. Hey, Lee, we've got to get a letter off to Sam Keen today talking about the fact that somebody said that title had been used before. Okay, today, not next week, today. But at any rate, Dick Price and I got a good, yesterday, we'll send it off. We got a good scheme going, only it didn't work. The scheme was that we were going to have an international get together of all the people who were working with body-mind combinations with particular aspect on the body.
Boy, would that be far out.
Yeah.
There are a lot of them around. There are a lot of them around, and they did have a meeting in 1958 over in Denmark. And they had expected to have continued with this, and I suppose that like everything and everybody else, they ran out of money, and they ran out of people who would do the work, because a thing like this is a hellish expensive and energy-consuming proposition. And Feldenkrais was chaired that meeting over there, and Feldenkrais was elected the president of the group, and this was just before I met Feldenkrais, and I mean just, it was a matter of days before I met Feldenkrais. And there are those people, and there are people at this point over in Japan, and all of these people should be brought together, not in a day's or a week's convention, but in 2 months' convention, when they all have time to get to see what the other guy's doing and how it works in and evolve some single
What a colossal
concept.
project.
It's a colossal, far-out project.
Who organized the last one?
The people in Denmark, a woman in Denmark whose name I do not remember. She could well be dead by now, 12 years ago.
I mean, how would you find out where all these people are at this point?
You would write to Dr. Feldenkrais. I would write.
Is he still alive?
Oh, indeed he is. And
Where's
in fact, I
that?
did write to him about it, and he was very enthusiastic about it. But you see, what happens with all these Europeans, they all know that it's only the Americans have money. So they sit back and they wait for something to get going. Now, if they're not going to deal with Americans, they get themselves moving. But if they're going to deal with Americans, they expect the Americans to pay the bills. And the thing they haven't found out yet is that we're just as poor as they are.
Where is
They're going
Feldenkrais?
He's in Israel.
Israel?
26
That's right.
Nachmani Street, Tel Aviv. And he was delighted. He was delighted to hear from us and so forth and so forth. But we've never been able to do any more about it. At that time, I didn't even have a secretary available. And so forth and so forth and so forth and so on. It would take at least 2 years to organize a thing like this before you got into touch with all these people and arranged the dates and all this and all that. So any of you who want to volunteer for a 2 years job, unpaid, guaranteeing you opportunity to approach plenty of people with your begging bowl in your hand, tell me, let me know, quick.
Who's supplying the saffron robe?
I'll supply the saffron robe.
That's a start.
Here's on this credit card number.
Yeah.
Well, the credit card number we still have. It's fixed prices, and I don't know whether he knows we're still using it. Don't tell him. I had to laughing the other day when I told him how many times I'd called Julian to give him Mary Hell, and that I always used his credit card. Okay, it's time to get to work. 20 after 10. You want to get working on Bob Driver and get him on his way. This is a letter from Jack Downing. Is there anybody here who doesn't know what the significance of that statement is? Jack, as you know, is in Arica, Chile, attending a training program like a lot of the rest of the guys around here, only they're not around here, in a Sufi group down there. Dear Ida, I had an interesting professional experience this week Rolfing Oscar Shazo, the master of the school. He was highly interested, having had a description from John Lilly and seeing this as wholly consistent with his own views. He is very, 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 as he talks with Latin emphasis, body-oriented. Yesterday he said, to be with your body, that is the deep, important thing. Emphasis is his. That is the deep, important thing. Our society is like our body. The macrocosm is like the microcosm. With this, we have to learn our society, the real deep laws, and the contradictions that stop our society. The training is heavily body-oriented. These first 3 months, this really sends me. These first 3 months, 2 hours daily of exercises drawn from yoga and other sources. A high-protein, low-carbohydrate diet, heavy in natural vitamins, no mention of supplements, plenty of sleep. All is first for the general health benefit. Secondly, for giving optimal energy for the work. There are people from Big Sur learning discipline. There are 4 areas of development. Developing the body-mind through mentations, the chakras, the centers, and the latifs, L-A-T-I-F-S. Numbers 3 and 4 haven't been explained yet. Apparently they are related to or similar to the chakras. He calmly relates all these, plus the horoscope and tarot, in one system, which he is now explaining. He speaks well of Gurdjieff, whom he says came from the same school. My small reading of Gurdjieff makes Oscar seem much, much, much clearer. Jack is getting Latin-oriented too, and less esoteric. Oscar, in fact, talks and teaches like the Jesuit-trained engineer that he is. He certainly works as hard. Oscar's first hour was one of those spectacularly fortuitous tissue memory demonstrations. He has a rather slight, firm frame, most characterized by a marked lordosis and rather barrel chest. I noted a forward downward displacement of the left clavicular head in typical old injury fashion. He related a fracture of the left humerus at 4 years, treated with a whole body cast and airplane splint. As I worked around the clavicular head, he recalled without outward reaction the entire episode, which was central in determining his entire later life, including his search for a life scheme, Weltanschauung, based on a mind-body spiritual social identity. Trialectics, he calls it. An additional point, he recalled that his father, a Bolivian general, was so affected by the little boy's obvious distress with a heavy cast, he removed it against the doctor's advice. The boy was so impressed by the doctor's warnings that he consciously maintained the same body and arm posture for months afterward. How do we get that way? Hence the present lordosis and slight atrophy of the left upper arm. As the left sternocostal edge was explored, a knot was found. Working here brought back the memory of the cast binding at the left rear, producing pain and spasm at the anterior point. In general, Oscar is the least tense, least painful person I've ever worked with. He had no pain in his thighs, and his leg muscles are as relaxed as his arms. Oh, I might add that he explored for the reason of his 4-year-old tissue fixation. And it was the usual. He avoided the pain and hence accumulated karma, his turn. In his subsequent self-exploration, he never could find the pain, as it was hidden behind shame over having the accident. I'll go ahead and do all 10, but don't expect much beyond this. If he ever comes to the States, as I expect he will, he hopes to see you, for he has conceived a considerable respect for your method, questioning me closely about how you developed it. I'll say this, if he continues to produce as promised, he's an important contributor to humanity, and his teachings are completely consistent with yours and Fritz's work, adding astrology, the tarot, the Kabbalah. I'm sure Fritz would love it. And a few other minor points. Best wishes to your new class of novitiates. Peace, Jack Downing. Oh, could you show this letter to Dick Price and save me writing the same to him? Thank you. Where is my little pal? There she is. Thank you, ma'am.
You're welcome.
Okay. It's a very, very nice letter, and it really makes you feel as though you still had a link. You know, several of those guys promised they'd write me, but this is the first one that did. Anyway, so let's see. Today we go into the 5th hour, and that 5th hour brings us halfway through.
Is there an address on that?
Yeah, the return address is on here, and I want Lee to be sure to put it in the book so that there's no, it's not impossible to re-communicate. So, what have we managed to get done? Do you think we're halfway through? Do you think we're more than halfway through? Do you think we're less than halfway through?
Yes.
I have a feeling at the end of 7 is kind of halfway. That the end of 4 and into 5 is halfway in terms of time, perhaps, but not in the work itself.
Why do you think this? I mean, this did come up in the other class, but I'm trying to see is how much you people who are auditors in the other class really made this your own.
Well, it's only at the beginning of hour 8 that we begin. Well, let's see. I don't want, I'm trying to avoid making this too simplistic, but in general, the first 7 hours are largely concerned with freeing structures and almost taking apart. That's the simplistic thing I wanted to avoid.
But it's factual, even though oversimplified.
And only with the beginning of hour 8 do we begin to balance the halves of the body and reintegrate the structure in its new space and new level. So that the halfway point as far as the work is concerned comes with the switch from taking apart to putting together, even though the amount of time involved is disparate. That's my reasoning.
That's right. While I see Bob Pritchett back there, I want to remember something that happened this morning because I get forgetfuler and forgetfuler. Telephone rang about half an hour ago. The guy said, is this the house where you want to share a place with somebody? I said, no. He said, well, I saw a card up in the Nepenthe that there was somebody at this number who wanted to share a place with somebody. I said, oh, tell me a little bit more about it. He said, oh, there was a filmmaker. I said, oh, yes, now I know. So this guy had a big place down on Colorado, and he has a big studio place that he would have been interested in sharing. And I said, I think it's too late for this. I think they're all set, and we have sort of given up the idea of editing the film at this point because there isn't time and so forth. But I said, if you want, I will be glad to take your number, and maybe, and I thought maybe you'd like to get in touch with the guy, maybe you want to come up again another time or something, you know? And I put the number on some sort of something on the table, which Lee's probably thrown out now. So, at any rate, don't bother Lee, don't bother honey.
I'll find it.
He only wanted $100 a month. And he said he had a big room and he was willing to share it. And then I said something which made it apparent that you were 2 people, not 1 person, and so forth and so on. So all of this is it, and I hand it over to you, but I also hand over to one of you people the task of taking down that notice up in Nepenthe.
I'll do it.
Will you?
Yeah.
Good. So, coming back to where we belong, this is absolutely what I would have said, I think. But I would like to emphasize the fact that I hope that in the back of your head, at the end of every hour, you are looking with very considerable care at the possibility of taking the material that you had freed and putting it together. Now, up to this point, you did your putting together by certain basic methods. What were they?
The pelvic lift is the one back in the neck.
Basically, the pelvic lift. Who said it? Oh, you did, Bob. All right, why the pelvic lift?
Because what you do in each of these hours is free different parts from the pelvis, so that the pelvis can move more freely. And then,
Yes.
And so the idea of the lift is to put it in the place where it belongs, because the person himself is not able to do that.
This is true, but wait, let's get the emphasis slightly different. This thing is called the pelvic lift. And actually, that's what it ain't, so it really is a good name in here. Actually, I pinched that name from somebody else who did a pelvic lift. And when I pinched the name, it seemed an appropriate name. But at this point, realize that your pelvic lift is not a pelvic lift. It is a pelvic settling. It is a lumbar settling, a lumbar moving back. Any of you got a better name for it? Bring it up. Someday we might get a more significant, a more evocative name for this thing. We really need it. But you see, this came from a system of exercises, which you may someday learn, and that woman used to call it a pelvic lift. And actually, she didn't understand about lines. She was lifting a pelvis. And And sew it on. All right, the pelvic lift. Now what else? You said it before, Bob. Go back to it.
What else? What?
You said another method.
No, somebody else did.
I said the back and the
Oh, you did. I see. Yeah, the back. What's the point of that?
Well, again, you're working with the vertical column, and you're trying to get space in there, and you're having him bend over to give you the opportunity to get in between there, and to organize the whole column. And I hesitate on that word, but
All right, stay with it.
okay.
After all the rest of the world calls it that.
Okay, and that will give you the space, and it also helps to lift it off the pelvis and make it independent of the pelvis. Plus, it feels good to the man, and the man generally feels like it's an organizing kind of procedure. It puts it back in the place where you would like to be.
It helps if you keep that little simple metaphor in mind here. That spine is, after all, your tent pole.
Right.
And you got to be a very expert tent erector before you can just put that tent pole up once, and have it where it belongs. You shift it, you shift a little at the top, and you shift a little at the bottom, you shift it here, there, and the other place, to get those two sides better balanced before you're through. Unless it happens to be one of those modern tents which have the hose poked through that you have to put it in there, you know. But if you keep that metaphor in mind, you get more of a recognition of what it is you're trying to do. And you see the difference between the tent and the body is that body changes minute by minute, second by second. And you may suddenly find that you've got a longer right side than you ever had before. And you've got a longer right side, and you have to balance it against a shorter left side, because even if you try to lengthen the left side, you can't get the left side lengthened as much as the right side. You've all seen this kind of situation happening. So then you have to take that spine and sort of balance it, your tent pole, and balance it as best you may in there. And the third and final?
Well, the neck is the final.
That's right.
And you've helped organize the pelvis, the lumbar area, and then you've gone down the back, and the cervical area is the other end of the lumbar. And if you...
The cervical and lumbar are more related than the back and the lumbar.
Yes.
Realize this. That just as soon as you begin fiddling with a lumbar, you have got to fiddle with a cervical to balance it. Otherwise, the guy doesn't feel well, and he doesn't know why he doesn't feel well. And then you see comes the problem of lengthening the tent pole so that these two things are held at an appropriate distance apart. Soft tissue. You are demanding of the elastic soft tissue that it lengthens sufficiently to balance. And you see, this is something which has been going on from the first hour. The other something which has been going on from the first hour, I hope, I often find not, is that you are demanding of the body itself that it do this. And from the first hour, you have been trying to make these people aware of where is the top of your head. Where is your waistline? Let your waistline come back. No, don't push it back. Let it come back. These all sound like very simple words, but they're a very basic teaching. A very basic teaching procedure to get that man, that woman, to understand what it is that constitutes himself. And a little occasional meditation on the development of a human being throws more light on it. See the little 7-year-old we have here. See the teenagers that are in your family and so forth. Realize how little awareness, let alone understanding, they have of what's in their skin until such time as they begin to hurt. And then their whole universe is in one uproar. maybe a very minor hurt, but they are so insulted by the fact that they hurt. You'll see this under your hands over and over and over again. But if you will try to put yourself into their skin, understanding, getting reality on what a small part of perception the average individual is able to grasp in his teenage, in his early 20s, when his mind is focused on establishing his economic security, you will begin to understand more of what this problem is about, because this also has lines directly into it. If that small-sized child had the understanding of there being a goal to his carrying himself, perhaps, probably, in fact, he would carry himself that way. But for heaven's sake, don't try to give him that goal, or you'll have a very nice neurotic kid by and by. Because apparently the growth pattern is that the attention must be turned out during the early years. And if you invert that pattern and turn the attention in, you begin to get a quite distorted personality. But if you can project into that pattern, you begin to get a much greater understanding of how they got that way, and some insight into how you get them out of that way. Now, on the other hand, as you've seen here with Sean, as you'll probably see with little Sean today, and some other little young one that's coming in here today, they have a thoroughgoing perception of how much better they feel when this is established. But they don't have, and they don't get, and even the quite mature among them don't get an understanding of the fact that it's their business to create this, and probably it isn't. Because if this really were the way normal flesh behaves, creating this sense of responsibility, it would be there, and it isn't there. But even these very young kids, as you organize them, feel so much better that they no longer put much attention on the fact that you are hurting them. And you'll see this happening. It's the same way with little animals. I'm sure that sometime before this class is over, somebody will bring in a turtle or a poodle or a snake or something. That'll have to be Rolf here. And you'll see the same thing. They'll squirm and they'll semi-bite, but never really bite the hand that's hurting them. And then when you get to the key situation, they'll give a wild yelp and jump off your lap and run to the farthest corner of the house. And then they'll run straight back again to your hand or to your lap and begin licking your hand. And it's a very clear-cut demonstration. And it works the same way with little kids. The only problem with little kids is that they have already, no matter how little they are, they've already had a cap, a hat of attitudes set down on top of them long before they've come to you. And they can only make their adaptation within that framework of attitudes that is already fitting over them. One of the attitudes is that they mustn't, under any circumstances, be hurt. And you see, we fit this right on top of them. From the minute they're born, we fit this on top of them. And they learn it all too fast, instead of learning that minor hurt is like minor joy. It's part of the balance. Okay. So, now we've gone through, one, the organization of the external fascial bag. I still feel that it would be of so much value if we could get an actual, proper, appropriate representation of that. Two, the adjustment within that bag of the various end segments which are going to make possible the verticality of the packages that are being carried. 3, the organization so that the bag begins to walk. And so that when it begins to walk, the things inside aren't going to fall out, aren't going to put undue strain on the container. First hour, second hour, third hour is again an organization of the packages within the bag, a rearrangement of the elasticity that is within the bag. Fourth hour, now you begin to go down and get to what you've really been gunning for since the first time you laid your hand on that individual. You begin to go down and take a precise look at the precise problems involved, at the immediate problems is the word I mean. The immediate, the adjacent, the contained problems of the pelvis. How to get it horizontal. And as you're working with it, do not start worrying about whether you turned off the gas in the kitchen stove before you went out this morning. Get your mind on what's going on in the floor of that pelvis. What constitutes the floor of that pelvis? Which aspect of it is pulling? Which aspect of it has to pull? What is this doing in terms of putting strain on the contents of the pelvis and on the contents of the abdomen? What is going on? Because these 3 hours, the 4th and the 5th and the 6th, are your key situations. This is your opportunity, and if you lose them now, you're not going to get them back. In your 4th hour, your hands are in there around that floor of that pelvis, loosening the stuff which is keeping it askew. Did anybody bring that Kegel machine?
Yes.
Oh, wonderful. That's a big thing to call a machine, isn't it? I thought that probably that little thing was now mounted on a big little thing so that it was impressive.
Selling for $3,000.
Yes, selling for
It's a paraneometer.
Yes, I know that.
Kegel machine, this is my name for it.
Oh, that's your name for it. I thought that was the name that they had up at Vallejo.
There are other names for this machine, but I won't tell you
Yes,
what
I
they
know.
are.
They're not in polite. We're very polite society here. Don't mention anything that is polite. Somebody have something to
Yes,
contribute?
there's some a paper that he wrote about the
Exercising.
exercise and incontinence and stress.
Well, some of you spend a little bit of time, a little bit later. Yeah, I'm sure going to read this whole thing aloud to you people. Some of you spend some of your, quote, spare time when I'm not keeping you busy around here reading that. But I will say I've fallen down on my job, if you have any. But visualize, and even visualize here and now, what you're measuring with that machine. What is preventing? Where is the prevention of the balance? Because it isn't the balance that you're dealing with, as usual. It's something else. It's the thing that prevents the balance. And you see, you come over and over again to this recognition, this Rolf work. This whole bit, you're not dealing with the thing ever. You're going round and round and round and round and round and round. Something that has no reality in free space, but determines the reality in free space, determines the functioning of the reality of the free space. I think I have the time enough at this point Usually somewhere along the 10 hours, I discuss with you what has been named by the man who put it together, the epistemological profile. And at this point, in view of the emphasis that I've just been laying on, you are not dealing with free space. I think it might be appropriate to bring this discussion in here and now. There was a man, he may still be an is-man. He was a French professor in one of the French universities, I think Lille. His name was, well, I'll think of it in a few minutes maybe. At any rate, he was a member of the group who worked with Korzybski. He was at one time a trustee, I think, of the General Semantics Group. And he went home to France and he sat down and he thought. And what he came up with was the recognition of the open-ended process, which is thinking, which is analysis, which is evaluation, which is an attempt to get the meaning of something that you are seeing or you are experiencing. And this he called the epistemological profile. And it's a very useful tool for looking at what you are thinking about and making up your mind as to what level of thinking you're doing about it. And the first level, the very primitive level, represents feelings about a situation. And the metaphor, the simile I usually use is the little girl that goes down to the water and she sticks her toe in and she decides that this is a beautiful place for drama and she says, "Oh, it's cold!" She doesn't mean it's cold. She means it is cold to her. But this has never occurred to her. But big brother, who's in the 8th grade or maybe the 6th, comes along and says, "Ah, you sissy, I'll get a thermometer, I'll measure it." See, that is the next level of sophistication in terms of evaluating external phenomena. You measure it. And the great bulk of commercial, quote, science nowadays is measurement. It lies in this area. And you hear us sit here weeping all over the place because there aren't ways to measure them. It doesn't mean that I'm so unsophisticated that I think measurement's good. But it does mean that I am sophisticated enough that I know that I can make those other guys believe me if I can show them a measurement with a machine. And the vast bulk of the 9 doctors out of every 10 recommend Marlboro cigarettes or fluoride toothpaste or what have you. This all comes under this thing. All the stuff that's reported with the white coats and the white pants and the beautiful pictures in the slick magazines, and they pay a lot of money to put those pictures in. This all represents that next door to primitive level of evaluation. So it's no longer cold to the little girl, it's now cold to a machine, to a device. Now the level after that is the level where the apple hits Mr. Newton on the head. And Mr. Newton begins looking at things in terms of what controls the apple. There must be a certain set of laws and they must operate, and we can evaluate these laws. This is the level of science that we were all taught in colleges. This is the level of science that up to the days of Einstein there was nothing else but. And I suppose the great bulk of science today still operates in that level, although the great bulk of the money that is put behind science is no longer in that level. The great bulk of the money has been going since the days of NASA and ASA, not in ISSER, has been going into a consideration of relationship. A consideration of the fact that nothing is anything except in an environment. That you don't know anything about anything except as it relates in an environment. This was the great contribution that Einstein made. Now actually, as I have said to you before perhaps, I think that there was some biological recognition of man in an environment before the early 1900s. I think that they began getting those ideas back in the 1890s. But they were very empirical ideas and nobody took them that seriously. With respect to human beings and the importance of their environment, it was perhaps the second decade of the century before advanced men in educational institutions began teaching their students that people had to be looked at in terms of their environment to be understood, and that there was an internal environment and an external environment. And a lot of that stuff came through the work that was contributed by the physical chemists of Yale, who made an intensive study of physical chemical changes of fluids of the blood and so forth. And all of this stuff, you see, has been developing, and people haven't been aware, really, of the fact that you could separate this out, and that's what you were really doing, was thinking differently now. And now in this department, you begin to see that the important thing is not anything, but that it is a relationship. It's funny, I still can't think of that man's name. Bachelard. Yeah, Bachelard. Mr. Bachelard's fourth area. Mr. Bachelard's fourth area calls your attention to the fact that it is the relationship that is the determinant, that is the important thing.
How do you spell his name?
Batchelard. I don't remember what his first name was. There has really been very little. There were a few translations of some of his original papers were made by a man named Bois, B-O-I-S, who is still a member of the General Semantics group now down in Los Angeles. That time he was in Montreal. And he was another typical Frenchman, and he thought like a typical Frenchman. And because of that, Bachelard's way of thinking appealed very much to him. And he published, I think it was in the Journal of General Semantics, 25 years ago maybe, some translations of these one or two scanty papers that Bachelard had printed. But oddly enough, nobody has ever really, nobody except Wolf has ever taken a hold, that I know of, this is of course, has taken a hold of this idea, which I think is a very useful measuring stick by which to look at ideas, and by which to look at, by which to evaluate how the other guy is thinking when he begins to present an idea to you. And then this is still an open-ended system. This is not the last way in which you can look at and get more information about your environment. And the final way is this way of the intuition, the intuitive perception, the psychic perception, the What's the name of the other stuff? Synchronicity phenomena of Carl Jung. Now, this way is not as yet available to most people. Most, even the top level of the generation, cannot control this area so that they can go into it at will and get information from it. Some people think they can. Most of them are nuts. What I mean to say is, they're the far out people. They're the people who are not regarded by scientists as reliable sources of information. And we don't regard this area as contributing to our scientific information as of 1970. But you see, what it is doing is beginning to swing the line all the way around on the spiral, ready to come into the first area on a higher level. Because this fifth area is an I am perceiving. When you say intuitively I know, there is nothing there except a perception. It seems to me, and it seems to me so vividly that I know that this is so. But you can't go and tell another guy that and have him believe it. And so the thing is going around in this spiral situation. And as you come out from your fifth area, you are now in a brand new first area. It is to me. And I don't know what goes after that. Maybe I'll come back 200 years from now and tell you, but maybe I won't.
That's the fifth level.
The next level is observation.
Perception to it.
The next level is observation with awareness of both observers.
Okay, you write it up. But now let's get back to where we came from. I am calling your attention to the fact that what I have been doing is literally herding you into this fourth area, trying to keep you thinking exclusively into this fourth area, trying to keep you everlastingly aware of the fact that it is the relationship which is the important thing. That it is the noumena here that goes out looking for the phenomena, not the third area, phenomena looking for a noumena. And if you can get hold of this little yardstick, 12-inch ruler, you can do a great deal to clarify, to look critically at your own thinking and to look critically at the thinking of people who present ideas to you more and more loudly as they're less and less sure of them. And you have a little stick that measures it here. Okay, so how did we get here? Oh, we got here. I know how we got here. All right, how do we get out of here? Always that confounded little pelvic floor gets us into all kinds of trouble. So that the relation of the pelvic floor to something which you can't measure like a gravitational field is what is going to determine the entire well-being of that individual. Now, realize what determines where the pelvic floor is. It's not those half dozen muscles which we named the other day as being the pelvic floor. Not at all. It's the sacroiliac articulation. It's the articulation between the fifth lumbar and the sacrum. It's the articulation between the fourth lumbar and the fifth lumbar. See what I'm telling you? Just as soon as you shift any of those lumbars back on any of those lumbars, you're going to get a different relationship in that pelvic floor. Just as soon as you take on the type of athletic training which shortens and tightens the hamstrings to the exclusion of the antagonists of the hamstrings, you're going to interfere with that pelvic floor. Just as soon as you do any of these habitual postures that spread the knees wide, thereby shortening the gracilis and altering the hamstring relationship in there, you're going to interfere with that pelvic floor. So that there is a vast terra incognita in there for each and every individual about how he developed these various physical attitudes, and therefore mental attitudes. And what we are doing here, of course, is to take the outermost layer of those attitudes and sort of organize them and relate them to the place where the attitudes themselves are less constricting, are less compelling than they otherwise had been. And where, as a result of the lesser compulsion that is in the muscle, you can get a lesser compulsion in the mind in terms of certain attitudes. And you can begin to look around and see some other things. Now then, so we have these 4th-hour pelvies. Now the question is, at this point, have they been horizontal? And if not, why not? And right here, I'd like to have some lineup, please. If you want to see pictures, but to emphasize this and emphasize the general, their general concepts of the specificity of minerals for a certain glandular activity. I thought that this would be of interest specifically to you people. And this he is going to do, and he is also going to talk to Bob Driver, because he says, he claims absolutely that he can handle leukemia through, that leukemia is a lack of a certain mineral. And he claims that he will personally see Bob Driver after or before or something and give him this one. But I'm sure of what it is. It's that whole business of beets, which I have sent for, but which hasn't arrived yet.
Don't tell Dr. Windrow.
No.
Well, don't tell anybody. Listen to what he's got to say.
Yeah.
And as far as I'm concerned, if I had what was bothering Bob Driver and somebody claimed that whole beet powder would fix it, I'd sure try it.
That's right, right.
There's no.
Can't hurt him.
It can't hurt. Nothing that this guy would give him would hurt. They're all food supplement things that are simply concentrated, you see. Grown in organic bases, etc., etc. But I thought that this would be of particular interest to you. And you see, he feels so precise about all this sort of thing, that this yeast that I gave Don, for instance, all this stuff is imported from Europe because there is no comparative product available here in the States.
Is he a source of supply for these things himself?
Well, he is a source of supply for about 3 or 4 different products. That is all. The only stuff he supplies is stuff that he feels you can't buy in a health food store or the equivalent. And this is the only stuff he bothers with. So obviously the man is not merely out to make a lot of money or be in on this whole supplement deal, which he isn't. Anyhow, looks like we're all here now. This is the day that the Lord hath made, is what comes to mind. 5th hour, right?
Yeah.
This is the end of the 5th hour. In other words, at the end of today, you are through half of the work that you're going to do. Now, you're through half of the manipulative work that you're going to do. So we better see to it that we really understand what's going on the way. Now, as I indicated yesterday, when you get to the 4th, the 5th, and the 6th hour, you have a package in your hands which is the central core of what is going to be done here. The 1st and the 2nd and the 3rd hour, you have been preparing to get to this. But the 4th and the 5th and the 6th hour, you are doing your stuff. You are doing what you're going to do with that pelvis to get it organized, horizontal, the base of the floor of it, the stuff that keeps the stuffing in, balanced so that the stuffing stays in and doesn't sort of ooze out around the corners. And you see, this oozing out around the corners isn't such a bad metaphor at all, because you actually get this sort of deterioration of tone, which lets everything pound down on the base of the pelvis. And what are the commonest things for which males and females get into hospitals, even as of today, if I'm not mistaken? Somebody's got to take the uterus of the female out, and somebody's got to doctor up the prostate in the man. Because there's been no support. And support is not a solid thing underneath. If you want to have some fun thinking, you get back in a corner and realize the change in the ideas of support that have come in the last 75 years since the turn of the century. When I was young, the symbol of support was the Rock of Gibraltar. It was as firm as the Rock of Gibraltar. And then an insurance company used as its symbol the Rock of Gibraltar. And a bank used as its symbol a pyramid or an Egyptian temple or something of this sort. This was support in those days. This was solidity. This was something you could rely on. But this is not what you can put the contents of a pelvis on. It's no good for that. It's not much good for banks. Those of you that lived through 1907 knew that too. So that the whole idea of support has changed. Nowadays, our banks are secure, in quotes, when you put them into glass so that you can see the farthest corner of them any hour of the day or night. It's an interesting change. And you see, this is reflecting in another department of life, that whole change that came in around the turn of the century when we began to understand relationship. And now that which is secure is that which is in a secure relationship. That you're a hammock that you're of energy that you're not going to fall out of. Something that is supported by imaginary lines. But apparently this gives you support, providing the lines are where the lines belong. Now as soon as you break down the place of where the lines belong, your support breaks down. And you see, we haven't gotten that far away from this old idea of support yet. We sit around and we talk, and we philosophize about this newer type of support. But the number of people that live on the face of the earth who really mentally live in this idea are few and far between. They talk about it. Now this is where your problem lies. To jack yourself up into the level where this type of support is real, and to drag with you a varying number of other people so that they can, quote, share your heaven. And so you see, that floor of the pelvis now becomes an outward and visible indication of how these lines of force are balancing. Where's Sharon? Oh, there she is. And you all realize why I was thinking of her. Now it is interesting that it's interesting to see how to me it's interesting to see how ideas develop. You take in mental and religious ideas, for example. It's now just about 100 years since the whole episode of American metaphysics opened its eyes back in New York State and Vermont and so forth and so forth. And out of it has come the whole Christian Science movement, the whole religious science movement, and various other lesser sects, all of whom are living and thriving, who believe that thoughts are things, who believe that you do healing through thinking. Now this is interesting because there is a certain amount of healing that I know darn well you can do through thinking because I've seen it. But the interesting part of it is that this is where the change in that idea came from 100 years ago. And now as we go on, instead of relying on this thinking tool, we are relying on a shifting of energy levels, energy ideas, as a means of mental and physical healing. And by healing, I'm not talking really about fixing up a broken bone or remedying a stomachache. I'm talking about making a man a whole man. And you see, it was those metaphysicians really who first got the idea that there is a wholeness coming in somewhere, but they so precisely pinpointed their very rigid approach that it prevented them from getting further away and seeing it in a larger range. And it's only after 100 years that this now is beginning. You're now beginning to see these as outward and visible symbols of the progression of the ideas of energy. Now I'm going to get into tarot cards and astrology presently too. If Gus, what's his name, will do it down in Julie, I can do it up here. Anyway, so all of this, if you can get that floor of the pelvis, where that floor of the pelvis goes, you have an energy web underneath you, which then lets you come up. It not only lets you come up, it buoys you so that you are more comfortable up than you are down. And you see how you have developed this idea of the floor of the pelvis. You've first gone into it very primitively, so to speak. You have actually approached it in terms of the muscles which literally attach at the edges of the floor of the pelvis, which is logical. And this has been your fourth hour. And you've gone all around it. You've made your first step into the area by way of the adductors. All of the adductors. Because it is the adductors that are most intimately attached to the actual muscles which constitute the floor. And then you realize that by the time you get to the adductor magnus, you're not really in a true adductor in the sense that it attaches to the ischial tuberosity, and it is the immediate neighbor of the hamstrings. And its function is not that different from the hamstrings. And I'm not quite sure as to why it was named as an adductor, because it didn't have the simplicity of function that the adductors have. But at any rate, you're still going around the edges of the pelvis. You're still making it possible to shift the pelvis in terms of the resilience that you're giving their attachments. And so in that fourth hour, and let's settle this once and for all now, we are going to do the adductors. We are going to finish with the hamstrings. And by the time you've done all that, those patients of yours, those subjects of yours have had it. And you better bring them to a place of balance where you can terminate the hour appropriately with a pelvic lift and something to organize the neck, as you understand, and call it a day. Now, when you come back the next time, you still don't like what you see, because you're still seeing a pot belly, and you're still seeing a certain amount of pulled downness of the thorax, and an imbalance. I mean, it doesn't please you. And as you begin to try to find out what else you can do to please yourself better, to relate, and now you've got to start relating things to the pelvis rather than only freeing the pelvis. So you're now getting into a more complicated setup. You're now getting to the place where you have got to make a thorax think it belongs to that pelvis. If not, where are you? You're still not, but you still haven't got a whole man. Because it is the whole man with which you're thinking and dealing and working in this room. And so as you meditate about this, and you're as sharp-eyed as Bev over there, you see to it, well, there's something here that isn't right. And you go in and you use your head at this point and realize that you have to deal with the rectus. Now, the minute you begin getting into the rectus, you begin working your way into some other considerations. For one thing, that rectus is going to organize. It's going to pull the pelvis up in front. This is the most obvious thing. It's going to let the rib cage, the lower ribs, the sternum, etc., go up, lift. But you are now getting into a different level of operation in that body, because the rectus is the antagonist of the psoas. And this is a something which nobody seems to have, a fact which nobody seems to have ever put to work consistently. Now, the psoas is a relatively unique structure in the body. Listen to what I've said. I've said that the rectus is the antagonist of the psoas. And seems to be a piece of just plain nonsense. When did you ever hear of an antagonist lying right next door to its agonist? And yet this is the way the thing works. As they cross the rim of the pelvis, pubes, the psoas is practically contiguous with the rectus. And I'm telling you, question mark, that these things are agonist and antagonist. Yes, I am, and you'll see it. Now, the psoas, as I've said, is unique in many respects. In the first place, it does have a motor function. But in the second place, it has a different quality about it than the average motor muscle. Because it is so intimately connected with the autonomic nervous system. Because the lumbar plexus is practically embedded on the surface of the psoas. And therefore, anything that exercises the psoas, that gives that pumping function which is exercise, which changes metabolism of an area, is going to affect the metabolism of the lumbar plexus. Now, the psoas is not very far from the solar plexus, but it's not as intimately connected as it is with the lumbar plexus. The psoas is not very far. Well, as you go down the line, the psoas gets further away because the psoas diagonally crosses the pelvis. And the autonomic centers are still lying right in front of the spine itself. The distance between the psoas and the spine becomes greater the lower you go. So, that psoas becomes very intimately connected with everything that is controlled through the lumbar plexus. This is particularly true of the whole bowel expiratory function. Now, look at the great American illness. How many dollars worth of anti-constipation remedies are sold annually, daily, what have you? How does it get that way? Why does it get that way? It gets that way because the psoas is literally thrown out, geared out. It's geared out because the rectus, you're looking for your daughter, I bet she'll get here.
I'm looking for my wife also. I didn't want her to leave until
Do you want somebody to stay at the gate?
No. They're coming in.
Oh, they are. You see?
I'll see them.
The rectus is the muscle that we train in all our orthodox physical training programs. All the push-ups, all the pull-ups, every last one of them is designed to shorten and to thicken and to do something funny with the rectus abdominis. And here you see you are disturbing the balance between agonist and antagonist. Because the more you shorten and thicken and make the rectus funny, the more you gear out the psoas and its function, letting it little and little completely deteriorate, so that you have no appropriate metabolic support for your nerve center there.
So push-ups are not good to do. If they shorten the rectus.
Look, Beverly, go back, sit back in the corner. By and by you'll get an answer. You won't be too dead. So, right here and right now, you begin to see from whence comes all the bay windows, from whence comes all the another irremediable cause of bay windows, of course, is the amount of surgery that has been done. Fortunately, this younger generation is no longer getting it. But my generation, you just didn't find these people without seeing a nice big scar across that abdomen, which now prevented and permanently prevented the falling back of the abdominal wall. And you see, all this gives you a picture of what begins to go wrong with the individual as he gets into the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, and by the 60s it's really wrong with him. He's been fighting all the way along the line, and now he's lost the fight. But you see, what you're dealing with here is now the growing conception of your need to deal with the psoas, your need to understand the psoas. Now there's another function of the psoas that you also need to put, quote, in its place, and that's the recognition of the fact that the psoas is the motor link, connecting link, between the legs and the diaphragm, the rib cage. So in other words, it's the thing that holds the top and the bottom together. Remember that the psoas attaches on the anterior aspect of the first, the second, the third lumbars. And the crura of the diaphragm lies immediately adjacent to it on the anterior surface of the first and the second lumbars. So along about the time that you get your psoas balled up, you've also got your diaphragm balled up. I remember in the old days when I was developing this, and I wasn't developing it from a developed philosophy, but from the actual practical experience, how amazed I used to be that many heart conditions didn't respond until you got into the 4th and 5th hour, when you got down there, I thought, to the attachment of the rectus. I didn't understand this. But now, what I say is that I wasn't dealing with the rectus at all. I was dealing with the psoas, and through the psoas with the diaphragm and the solar plexus, and the whole rhythm of the heart control there, coming through there.
Would you say that again?
I said that I thought that I had been dealing with the rectus abdominis, but that I had now concluded that I was really dealing with the psoas. Now maybe I wasn't, maybe I was dealing only indirectly with that psoas by virtue of the agonist-antagonist thing. But the fact of the matter remains that right down here is a control for the whole cardiovascular system. Not the control, a control. It may not be a control, but when it goes wrong, everything else goes wrong too. That's what I'm really trying to say. So that now you are getting into the 5th hour and you are dealing with the rectus abdominis, and realize that you cannot deal with the rectus abdominis except as you are also dealing with the psoas. These two things can't be separated. And if your psoas, through polio or some other situation, has been retired from service, so to speak, that rectus is taking on a burden which it cannot carry indefinitely. It, in its turn, is going to try to get help from here, there, and the other place. So that now you begin to see the significance of that 5th hour in which you are dealing with the rectus as a unit, and with the psoas as a unit if you can get back there. You can't always, and you can many times. Many times you can just get your fingers back and literally go scrape along the front edge of the lumbars. Literally, and in your scraping, it isn't that you scrape the psoas off, but that you scrape some energy into the deteriorated structure. But with people, particularly with the mesomorphic type, you have a lot of trouble getting back there. Endomorph you can get through. An ectomorph doesn't have anything to keep you out. And a mesomorph is not going to stand for it without a lot of fuss. So this is what you were doing yesterday, and this is what you're going to be doing today. You start up there around, by the way, Beverly, where does the rectus attach?
At the
Hey, look in your head.
xiphoid process, and also at
Not
the,
really.
Not
The xiphoid is pretty independent, I think. Right.
I thought it connected at the.
Look in your
the
book.
I thought.
Book says it does.
The book says it's really attached.
The book says that the xiphoid is one of the attachments.
And it's the fourth, fifth, and sixth costal.
Fifth,
Sixth, and seventh.
yeah. Well, I don't know, but it goes as high as the fifth rib.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So you're going to start your work way up around the fifth rib. And it goes quite a way out on the fifth rib. And as you look at what you can't get, I mean, you get the feeling of how the fifth rib and on down should look. And then you look at the individual and you can't get it. And then you have to look as to why you can't get it. And sometimes this will carry you far afield. But what I complain about is when you just go afield, as Owen went afield yesterday on Fritz, and I said that isn't fifth hour way over under there. And yet maybe Owen was right. Maybe this was the place that literally held it. But the problem is that in a proper fifth hour there's so much to be done that if you go gathering daisies right when you start, you're not going to get to the end of the road in the time allotted. So that you have to get considerable discrimination. And your goal, your immediate goal, is this business of getting elasticity into those two rectus muscles. Now, another one of the things that you have to bear in mind, this is a practical warning, and I bid you be warned. It is highly possible for you to pull those two rectus muscles apart. It has never happened to me or anybody I was working with, but in theory at least, if you just go after a single rectus muscle, or you go after it this way instead of this way, you are doing a very dangerous, hazardous business. So always bear this in mind, that however you are dealing with those rectus muscles, you always have a component which brings them together in your fingertips once they're off the rib cage. I know that you all know about umbilical hernias. As a matter of actual fact, in the case of an umbilical hernia, which has only relatively recently happened, you can get them to heal this way. I don't make any promises, but I've seen them. I've seen umbilical hernias the size of a silver dollar. I forgot. You people don't know what a silver dollar is. But I've seen this thing just close itself right up again if you bring the rectus in. And realize that. This becomes a dangerous procedure unless every one of the eyes in those 8 fingers keeps looking to see how the strands of that rectus lie and keeps bringing them together. And you see, they belong together And it is when they are together that you are able to induce the appropriate elasticity. Because you remember the first rule of Rolfing is you bring the structure toward the direction in which it should be before you start demanding movement of it. So that part of that fifth hour direction is that you bring those recti together. And then you have organized the top, the attachment from the fifth rib down. You've sort of pretty well cleared it up as it goes over the edge of the thorax. Don't get the feeling that it's not stuck on that rib. So that the rib in respiration is dragging on it. And then sometimes it pays better to just sort of hop, skip, and jump down to the other end. And sometimes it doesn't. And this is something you have to sort of get a feeling for. At any rate, you're going to have to do the two ends and the middle. And when you go down to the other end, hear that voice of the top dog talking to you, as Hector would say, reminding you to visualize the relationship at the other end between rectus and psoas. Let your fingers tell you. Let your fingers talk to you. Now the funny part of it is that you will find pubic pubes in the strangest places. They may be almost literally projecting outside the abdominal wall, and they may be so deep in that it's all you can do, searching with your fingers to find them. And you say, my God, the guy's lost his pubes. And it may take a considerable search to find it. And either of those situations, when you have cleared the psoas and the rectus, either one will come to a midpoint, to a balance at a midline where you find it easily with your fingers, and it talks to you, and it's clean, and your fingers can differentiate between rectus attachment and psoas transmission. Sometimes you'll find that the pubes seem to be, that the whole pubic structure just dives down on one side. You can't find it on one side, and it's a perfectly normal position on the other side. The guy has trouble with his walking, and he doesn't know why. He has pain in one hip, and he doesn't know why, etc., etc. And all of these things your fingers are going to learn about. But always remember, as I say, the voice of the top dog says, you should get those things up where they are balanced and where you recognize that the bone, the pelvic bone, belongs if you're going to get your horizontal pelvis, because you're still gunning for a horizontal pelvis. And the discussion this morning has only added to your understanding of why you want the pelvis horizontal. Now this constitutes the fifth hour. Do not forget that in that fifth hour you also have a minor goal of organizing the legs to the proper width. Many, many times those legs are too close together. Many, many times those legs are too far apart. But in that fifth hour, you see, as you go down in that general groin area, it's your job to get the length of the connections that hold the leg into the pelvis wide enough that the leg can sit out where it belongs or narrow enough that it brings it in where it belongs. This is part of the fifth hour work. The organization of the whole groin structure belongs, and of the groin structure as a whole, belongs properly in the fifth hour. And you see now you are beginning to really get to a place where a lot of the work on that pelvis is done. And you will then be ready to go along into a sixth hour.
To be continued.
To be continued.
Tomorrow for the next exciting chapter.
The next exciting chapter. Shall we have coffee? Shall we get to work? What shall we do?
I do see an awful lot of people with rectus muscles that are quite far lateral.
Oh,
I think
yes.
that's a common thing to...
Oh, yes, but bring them in. They'll always come in. They'll always come in. Everything in the body tends to move lateral. And having gotten stuck lateral, they have to keep going around and around and around and around and around. So one of the most difficult problems with the rectus muscle nowadays is the surgical scars. And as I say, it's nothing like as difficult as it was 20 years ago, because there was so much more invasion of body through surgery than there is now.
There's a lot more transverse incisions than there used to be.
Yeah, but even these vertical incisions, the scar tissue really messes things up in a big, big way.
Well, surgeons used to think that the best way to incise an abdomen was to open parallel to the muscle fibers. But actually, opening perpendicular to the muscle fibers is much more effective.
Well, I do know that I just don't have as much trouble nowadays as I used to have. And of course, in the old days, there was a period, again, about 25, 30 years ago, when every time a woman got into any consistent menstrual problem, some surgeon thought it would be a very good idea to take the uterus out. And then, you see, you had the whole area of the uterus and adnexus that had to be filled in with connective tissue. One woman came to me and reported that she had been to a gynecologist, and he had said that the next time she got into trouble like this, he was going to take the uterus out, because the uterus seemed to be a poison in a woman anyway.
That's what he said.
Well, that's not an unusual viewpoint.
That's a case of
Yeah,
uterus.
but they shouldn't have knives in their hands when they have that viewpoint. As Don says, an MD is just fine so long as you don't put him in a white coat. As window washers and what else was it? Plumbers,
carpenters.
The first, no, he really wasn't the first man. He was the first scientifically inclined man to look at the fact that body structure and body behavior had a relation.
Before all of these guys was William James, too.
Reich's view was not the view of the man as a whole. Reich's view was the view of the man as a pelvis.
Yes.
And a man may be basically a pelvis, but he's more than that. Alexander saw the light, perhaps more than any of the rest of them, A.M. Alexander. But you see, Alexander was not a scientifically trained individual. He was an actor. He was a neurotic down to the core. He didn't want to convey what he saw. He wanted to keep himself, in my opinion, this is what I see in his books. He wanted to keep himself up on his own little pedestal as he knew, and of course you couldn't know because you weren't as bright as he. The history of Alexander is very, very interesting. Do all of you know it?
No.
Well, Alexander was an Australian actor, and he went to London, and somewhere in the middle of his London acting, he lost his voice. Now he was an actor not only without a job, but without a voice to get a job. And this went on for a year and a half, 2 years. And finally, his voice returned. And as he was in good voice there, he thought, and he got his job, and he went back to the stage. And lo and behold, in the middle of the performance, he had no voice. Now, anybody else, with all those psychoanalysts around them, would have known that he just didn't want to sing, and that therefore he lost his voice. But Alexander wasn't bright enough to know that, so he started looking for a different premise. And Alexander went back to his room, and he decided that he was doing something on the stage which cut off his voice. And so he started doing his, practicing his songs, or speeches, or whatever it was, before the mirror in his bedroom. And he saw, you see, that he was doing this, and that somehow this cut off his voice. And from there on, he started thinking about how do you get your head on top of your neck and your neck on top of your shoulders, but particularly your head. And he worked through the only medium that he knew, which was a voluntary direction to do something, and then to do it. In other words, this was a mind-body technique which he now developed. Technically speaking, it was a self-hypnosis technique sort of thing. It was a suggestion sort of thing. Top of the head straight up, back of the head straight back. And you do it often enough, and various things happen. You see, Alexander and Reich had now done the two ends of the line, and nobody had put them together in the middle. And Feldenkrais, this was in the early years of the war. It was in 42, 43, something like that. Maybe 41, 42. Feldenkrais was a well-trained physicist, but a well-trained physicist. He'd worked with the Curie group, and in fact in one of the basement rooms of the University of Paris at this day there is a bronze plaque that says that Curie and what was the name of his son-in-law and Moshe M. Feldenkrais worked in this room on the problem of so-and-so. So Feldenkrais was a man who'd done a lot of thinking in terms of physics. And why and how this guy, who was born a Russian, a Ukrainian Jew, and who later became a citizen of Israel, how he happened to be in England and subject to English service requirements, I don't know. But at any rate, he was stationed up in Scapa Flow in some of the radio installations up there, something of this sort. And here he was, stuck away in Scapa Flow, and there wasn't a physicist within 1,000 miles. And he was pretty lonely, and he couldn't think what to do with his evenings. So he sat down and he started in thinking about structure and personality. He had already had a lot of Freudian analysis. And he was thinking in terms of Freudian analysis. And you see, he went somewhat of the route of Reich, in the sense that Reich, I think, was probably the first one who realized that if you were going to get Freudian results, you had to have a mechanics through which you got them. And Reich set out to try to find that mechanics, and within limits Reich did. But Feldenkrais went further than this, and again, he was not limiting his view of the man to the pelvis, as all these psychoanalysts were doing. He was putting the man together as a whole, and he was calling attention to the fact that the man as a whole, in terms of his posture, which is behavior, betrayed other levels of behavior, psychological, the immaturity or immaturity of behavior. And so Feldenkrais, sitting up there in Scapa Flow, wrote that manuscript. And when he got some time off, he went down and he got an appointment with F.M. Alexander. And he called on Alexander, and Alexander was pretty cool to him, and he left his manuscript there and asked him to read it. He would call for it the day after tomorrow or what have you. And when he got back, F.M. Alexander just about literally, now I'm telling you this firsthand, Feldenkrais himself told me this, he just about literally kicked the guy down the brownstone steps and the manuscript after him. And why he did this, I don't quite know, except that he probably recognized the fact that this was a very dangerous competitor. And that was the end of Feldenkrais and Alexander. And Feldenkrais kept his cool about it, but Alexander obviously didn't. But then Alexander wasn't cool about anything or anybody. Alexander was a man who saw to it that he didn't get along with anybody. And the people that surrounded him were his own family, who couldn't escape from him. And the only one in the world that could influence him at all was a certain niece of his, who then saw to it that she lived with him, keeping track of Uncle and seeing to it that Uncle ate on time, things like that. And she married a young doctor, and this young doctor also went in for the Alexander thinking and work. And he is no longer a young doctor now. I'd say he's in the 65s or so. But at any rate, he has the Alexander technique, or he did have when I used to play in England, set up in one of the hospitals with reasonably good documentation. He has a lot of photographs and so forth showing what the Alexander technique has done. And the Alexander technique still has a fairly good reputation in England. And then within the Alexander School, there were 2 or 3 other very gifted, relatively gifted teachers that stood out above the rest of the gang. And presently they broke off, because you see, with this kind of personality at the head of the thing couldn't hold itself together. And I forget the name of the man that made the biggest dent in it. I think he's dead now too. At any rate, he had as a patient the man who was the treasurer of England, the Lord of the Treasury in England during the war years. He was a socialist, Sir Stafford Cripps. And Sir Stafford Cripps was very much impressed with what had been done for him. He wasn't a particularly rich man, but he saw to it that this splintered group got itself pretty well established in England. And Lady Cripps, after Sir Stafford's death, Sir Stafford was a man who was, I think he literally died as a result of a gastric ulcer. Anyway, he had a frightful gastric ulcer all during those years when he gave his services to the Treasury, the Lord of the Exchequer in England. And how the guy carried on, I don't know. Apparently he thought he carried on by virtue of this Alexander technique. And Lady Cripps supported this group. I don't mean exclusively, but she gave her moral support and the support of her altitude and so forth to this particular splinter group rather than to the main Alexander group. So that this became one of the principal factors in the Alexander work in England. I knew Lady Cripps. In fact, I treated her once or twice. And she left me to go to Africa to visit a daughter of hers who was married to one of the politicians down in Kenya or something. So, at any rate, that's the story of Alexander. Except he was an exotic guy. He never had any money in his pocket, and when he happened to get some money in his pocket, he would go to the racetrack, and invariably he would succeed in losing all the money he had. And he would practically have to walk home, ups and downs, and so forth and so forth. And this would go on over and over and over again. He never learned, but he was an interesting figure. And he had one brother who apparently was not as interesting a figure, but a man who was more by attitude more suitable for the work. And this brother, I don't remember what his name was. At any rate, this brother did a lot of spreading of the true Alexander gospel, and this brother came to North America and did a lot of work along the East Coast, particularly in Boston, and from there he went up into Montreal. And as a result of the work of that brother, there is at this point still quite a going group of Alexander teachers in this country. They don't make as much noise as perhaps they're entitled to make. But you see, the Alexander work is a work, basically a suggestion work. And suggestion does work. But after it works, you've got to keep on suggesting. And this is the reason why what you are doing is not a competitor of the Alexander method. What you are doing would not be as precise if I had never heard of the ideas of Alexander. He contributed a great deal to my thinking. He was the first man, perhaps the only man, before this school of work, right here in this room, that ever gave real consideration to where a head belonged with relation to a body. There have been no others, really. There have been people who thought of where top vertebra belongs, the atlas, the axis. But there's been nobody that has related the weight of the head to the structure of the supports. And so you see, you people owe a debt to Alexander, and you'd better know it, because this question will come up over and over again. Oh, have you ever heard of the work of F.M. Alexander?
Yes.
And you better say yes.
Dr. Rolf, there's a new book, The Resurrection of the Body.
I have heard of it.
And it has a footnote that gives some insight into what he does other than the head.
I would like to see the book.
Yeah,
I'll see to it when I get it.
I don't have it.
I'll see.
I read it. And
I have heard of it, and I've been intending to do something about it for a long time.
Who's the author group?
It's a collection of F.M. Alexander's.
Yeah.
And, but Alexander himself didn't want to communicate. And if you read his books, this is perfectly obvious.
Yeah.
On the other hand, Alexander had some of the same problem that we have right here. He was trying to communicate as something that nobody had thought about before. And he wasn't that much of an intellectual that he knew how to deal with the problem of words. And so he talked around and around and around and around, and as far as I'm concerned, reading those books of Alexander's is an absolute punishment. But you try it, maybe you like to be punished. Because he doesn't get to the point, he doesn't say what he really means. And what he did in his books was simply to build up his own reputation. And this was all right, too. Alexander had a schedule book that read like the Almanac de Gotha. Everybody on in the top drawer in England went to Alexander's or to this other guy's that was strips supported. And this is the story of Alexander. Now, it behooves you to think of this and to recognize the fact that this other end of the body that you are going to be dealing with next week is it's a related problem, but it's a problem that warrants as much thought as your pelvic end. And you have to relate it into that whole pelvic problem. Now, this is what Alexander didn't do. He thought about the head. He was interested in the head, he was interested in the throat, because he was basically an actor, and by temperament. I mean, everything I've been talking about is this temperament of a very gifted actor. But he didn't recognize the fact that until you set that head on top of a well-defined, secure structure, you didn't have something that was going to stay with you. Now, Alexander had a pair of very gifted students, had a lot of very gifted students. But there was a Mr. and a Mrs. Gerald Lee, who came at various times from Northampton, Massachusetts, and New York City, who were among his most gifted disciples. I say that because they had further insights. And because they had further insights, Alexander really threw them out. Gerald Lee was a little bit of a guy, and Mrs. Lee was a little bit of a gal. In fact, Mrs. Lee was more like a hummingbird than any woman I've ever known. She had been a teacher of creative writing in Smith College for endless years, 50 probably, before she died.